A sales rep drove into McPherson County, Kansas, in December 1977 with a pocket calculator and a pitch. "Your wood dryer is costing you 40 hours of labor a year. My electric dryer pays for itself in 3 seasons." The 73-year-old farmer listened politely and said nothing. 6 weeks later, the blizzard of 1,978 buried Kansas under 4 feet of snow. Power lines collapsed. The outage lasted 9 days at -35 degrees Celsius. Every electric dryer in the county went cold. Wet corn began to mold. And that same sales rep sat in a shelter with no answer. The farmer? He was still working. Find out why. McPherson County, Kansas, January 1978. The first thing that Kansas winter teaches you, if you are paying attention, is that the wind is not a weather event. The wind is the weather. Everything else, the snow, the ice, the temperature that drops past zero and keeps going, arrives on the wind, is carried by the wind, and is given its full power by the wind. A Kansas blizzard without wind is merely an inconvenience. A Kansas blizzard with the wind it typically brings is something else. A reorganization of the world into a single hostile element that has no interest in your plans, your livestock, your stored grain, or your life. Roy Abernathy had been farming in McPherson County for 51 years when the storm arrived in January of 1978, and he had survived 4 blizzards in that time that he considered serious. 1,940 Ichenjobai Wushichi, and 1,971 and a dozen lesser events that qualified as merely difficult. He had learned, through those experiences and through the instructions of his father before him, a particular way of reading the sky in the week before a major storm. The clouds came from the northwest, low and moving fast. The barometric pressure dropped in a way that the old aneroid gauge on his kitchen wall showed more dramatically than any modern instrument, because the gauge was 50 years old, and its needle had been calibrated in a time when people relied on it absolutely. When that needle dropped past the 2.9-inch mark in under 6 hours, Roy Abernathy put on his wool coat and walked out to the woodshed and counted his cordwood. He had done this in October, as he did every October, so he already knew the count. 14 cords of seasoned white oak, cut in lengths of 16 inches to fit his firebox, split the previous March and stacked under the shed roof where the air could move through it for 9 months. He stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at the stacks and calculated, as he had calculated many times before, what he had against what he might need. 14 cords of white oak, properly dried and properly burned, would produce approximately 23 million BTUs per cord, or, across the full inventory, somewhere near 322 million BTUs of available heat energy. His wood-fired corn dryer, which he had built in 1944 from a design his father had shown him, and which he had modified 3 times since then, consumed approximately 1.2 cords of wood per 24 hours of continuous operation at full temperature. His hog barn, with its supplemental wood stove for extreme cold, needed another half cord per day to keep the interior temperature above freezing for the 340 head of hogs it currently housed. Combined, his maximum daily wood consumption in an emergency was approximately 1.7 cords per day. 14 cords divided by 1.7 cords per day gave him approximately 8.2 days of maximum operation. He had enough wood to run everything at full capacity for over 8 days without any resupply. He walked back to the house and told his wife, Dora, that they were going to get a significant storm. "How significant?" she asked, without looking up from the bread she was shaping. "Significant enough that I'm going to fire up the dryer tomorrow morning and get the last of the wet corn through before it hits," he said. She nodded. She had been married to Roy Abernathy for 46 years and had learned to treat his weather predictions with the same respect she gave the forecasts on KFDI radio, slightly more, if she was honest with herself. Roy had come to his wood-fired dryer, the way most farmers in his generation came to their equipment, through necessity, through observation, and through the particular inheritance of a grandmother who had lost everything once and never forgotten what that felt like. Her name was Edna Abernathy née Coulter, and she had come to McPherson County from Missouri in 1901 with her husband, James, and 2 children and a wagon full of seed corn, and the specific, durable optimism of people who believed that hard work and good land would produce a life worth living. They had been right, for a while. The 1920s had been good years on the Abernathy place. The early 1930s had been difficult but manageable. In October of 1936, the fall had been the wettest in the county's recorded history to that point, and the corn came out of the fields at moisture levels between 21 and 24%. Edna and James had no dryer. No one in that part of McPherson County had a dryer in 1936. You put the corn in the crib, and you waited for the winter cold to bring the moisture down. And in most years that was sufficient. In the fall of 1936, it was not sufficient. The wet corn in the crib began to heat in November, the slow, biological heat of mold and respiration, the same thermal process that makes a compost pile warm to the touch. By December, the temperature at the center of the crib was above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. By the first week of January 1937, when James Abernathy opened the crib door and smelled the sour, alcoholic smell of fermenting grain, they had already lost half the corn. What remained was so contaminated with mycotoxins they did not call it that in 1937, but that is what it was that the hogs who ate it sickened and died within 2 weeks, all 44 of them. Edna Abernathy sat in the kitchen on the morning after the last hog died and said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, to her daughter-in-law Roy's mother, who was 26 years old at the time and pregnant with Roy, something that was written down that evening in Roy's mother's diary, and that Roy himself had read when he found the diary in a cedar chest after his mother's funeral in 1969. Firewood in the shed is ours. Electric and gas belong to someone else. In a blizzard, you can only trust what's yours. She had not been talking about dryers. Specifically, dryers were not yet a common farm technology in 1937. She had been talking about the deeper principle, the distinction between resources you control completely and resources whose availability depends on a system larger than yourself. Coal required a dealer. Propane required a supplier. Electricity required a utility and a grid, and 1,000 miles of wire. Wood required only a forest, an axe, and the willingness to work. Roy had built his first corn dryer in 1944, when he was 39 years old, and had been farming his own 280 acres for 14 years. The design was simple: a firebox fabricated from a repurposed 500-gallon fuel tank, a sheet metal plenum connecting the firebox to a perforated floor drying bin, and an electric fan small, 1/3 horsepower to move the heated air upward through the grain. The dryer could handle approximately 200 bushels per batch, drying corn from 20% moisture to 14% in about 18 hours, at a fuel consumption of roughly 1 cord of wood per batch. He had upgraded it twice, in 1957, when he enlarged the firebox to increase BTU output by approximately 40%, and in 1966, when he added a second drying bin that allowed him to run 2 batches simultaneously. By 1978, his system could handle 400 bushels per batch, process approximately 800 bushels per day of continuous operation, and dry corn from 22% moisture to 13.5% below the 14% standard that grain buyers required in a single extended cycle. His neighbors used propane dryers. Most of them had installed soak-up electric units between 1968 and 1974, when propane prices were stable and the equipment dealers were offering financing terms that made the capital cost easy to absorb. A full soak-up system dryer, grain handling equipment, control panel ran to about $11,000 by 1975, which was a significant investment, but one that the extension service projections of the time showed paying back in labor savings within 7 to 9 years. Roy Abernathy had looked at those projections when Phil Decker, the Sukup dealer who covered McPherson and Rice and Harvey counties, had brought them to a Farm Bureau meeting in the fall of 1974. He had looked at them carefully because he was not a man who dismissed numbers. He understood the arithmetic of labor costs. He understood that carrying 1 6-inch logs from the woodshed in January was a physical demand that a 73-year-old man could not make indefinitely. But he had also looked at the line in the projections that said, in the careful language of equipment dealers who do not wish to raise uncomfortable questions, assumes continuous propane availability at current market prices. He had not said anything at the meeting. He had driven home, put the truck in the barn, walked to the woodshed, and counted his cordwood. Phil Decker was a good salesman in the specific, competent sense of a man who understood his product, knew the financial landscape of his customers, and genuinely believed that what he was selling improved people's lives. He was 44 years old in January of 1978, with a wife and 3 children in McPherson and a sales territory that covered most of central Kansas. He drove a 1976 Chevrolet C10 pickup in Sukup Green. The company provided the truck, and he carried in the glove compartment a Texas Instruments TI-30 calculator that he used at farm kitchen tables across the county to demonstrate, in precise numerical terms, the cost of Roy Abernathy's stubbornness. The demonstration was the same each time, with minor variations for the individual farm size and labor rates. He would set the calculator on the table, ask the farmer how many hours per week he spent maintaining and operating his wood dryer during the October-December drying season, multiply by the farmer's self-reported value of his own labor time, add the cost of chainsaw fuel and maintenance for wood cutting, add the cost of any hired help for splitting and stacking, and produce a total annual labor cost figure that was typically between $2,800 and $4,400. He would then compare this to the annual propane cost of the equivalent Sukup system, which, at 1,975 propane prices, ran to approximately $1,900 for a similar volume of grain. The difference, call it $900 to $2,500 per year in Roy Abernathy's favor toward his old system in raw fuel costs, but against him in labor costs was, Phil argued, the quantified measure of an irrational attachment to an obsolete method. He never said it in those terms to Roy directly. He said it at Farm Bureau meetings, in the particular tone of a man presenting facts to a community and allowing the community to draw its own conclusions. At the October 1977 Farm Bureau meeting 3 months before the January storm, Phil Decker had introduced a new element into his presentation. He had attended a seminar in Wichita on farm management efficiency, and he had come back with a concept that he found genuinely illuminating: the idea of hidden costs and option value in farm capital decisions. He explained, with the calculator and a pad of paper, that an obsolete dryer represented not just current inefficiency but foreclosed future options. You couldn't add moisture sensors, couldn't integrate with grain management software, couldn't capture data on drying rates that would improve future harvest decisions. Roy Abernathy had been in the back of the room during this presentation, as he usually was at Farm Bureau meetings, present, attentive, and quiet. When Phil finished and asked if there were questions, Roy raised his hand. "What happens to your system when the power goes out?" he asked. Phil looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has heard this objection before. "A 3-day backup generator is a common addition for about $2,400, he said. "Amortized over the system's life, it adds about 12 cents per bushel to drying cost." "What if the power's out for longer than 3 days?" Roy asked. "That would be an unusual situation," Phil said. "It would, Roy agreed. He did not say anything else. Several people in the room turned to look at him, and he was already looking at his hands, and the meeting moved on. The storm arrived on the morning of January 19th, 1978, which was a Thursday. It had been preceded by 4 days of cold temperatures in the single digits, dropping to -12 on the night of January 17th, that had already frozen the ground to a depth of 18 inches and coated every metal surface on the farm with frost that you could scrape off in sheets. The sky on the morning of the 18th had that specific quality that Roy associated with serious incoming weather. A high, thin, overcast that diffused the light without blocking it, turning everything the pale, shadowless white of old photographic paper. The wind had shifted to the northwest in the early afternoon of the 18th and increased through the night, and by the time Roy woke at 4:30 on the morning of the 19th and walked to the window, he could hear the wind working on the barn roof and see the first horizontal snow driving past the yard light. He dressed in his wool underclothes, his canvas work pants, his flannel shirt, his wool sweater, and his insulated overalls, and then his barn coat over everything, and his wool cap and his insulated work gloves, and went out into it. The temperature was -22 degrees Fahrenheit. With the wind, and the wind was running at approximately 40 miles per hour from the northwest, with gusts he estimated at 60, the effective temperature against exposed skin was somewhere below -50 degrees. He had been in colder wind chills, in the blizzard of 1949, but not often. He had a rope strung from the back door of the house to the barn, as he had strung it every winter since 1941, when a neighbor named Carl Perkins had walked from his house to his barn in a blizzard and missed it in the whiteout conditions, and been found 2 days later in the snow 80 yards south of his barn door. Roy had strung the rope and showed it to his sons, and told them the story of Carl Perkins, and the rope had been renewed each fall ever since, and now it guided him through zero visibility to the barn door in 45 seconds. He checked the hogs first. The barn's interior temperature, with the animal's body heat and the insulation of the heavy timber walls, was holding at about 18 degrees cold, but not immediately dangerous for healthy hogs. He started the supplemental wood stove, a cast-iron airtight that he had installed in the barn's southwest corner in 1955, loaded it with 4 pieces of white oak from the barn's internal woodpile, and adjusted the damper for a slow, sustained burn that would hold the stove for 4 to 5 hours without reloading. The hogs would be fine. He went to the corn dryer next. He had run the last batch of wet corn through on the 17th, a 400 bushel batch at 21% moisture, and it was sitting in the finished bin at 13.8%, ready to transfer to the main storage bins when he had time. The dryer itself was cold, the firebox ash gray and silent. He opened the firebox door, cleaned out the ash into a metal bucket, and began laying a new fire. Newspaper, then kindling, then increasingly larger pieces of wood, until he had a foundation fire established. He adjusted the damper and the draft to produce the controlled, steady combustion that would bring the firebox up to operating temperature without thermal shock to the metal. The fire was well established within 30 minutes. He transferred the finished corn to the main storage bin through the enclosed transfer auger, loaded a new 400 bushel batch of wet corn. This was the last of his unharvested wet corn, which he had been working through since October, and set the fan and the temperature controls for a standard drying cycle. Then, he went back to the house for breakfast and listened to KFDI on the AM radio. The forecast was for continued blizzard conditions through Sunday. Storm total snowfall of 18 to 24 inches. Drifts to 12 feet in exposed areas. Temperatures remaining below zero through Tuesday. Wind chill advisory for temperatures equivalent to -45 to -55 degrees Fahrenheit. He noted that the forecast said nothing about power. It did not need to. Roy Abernathy understood what a storm of this magnitude would do to the power infrastructure of McPherson County. The distribution lines ran on wooden poles across open fields, exposed to every wind and ice load the weather could generate. A sustained wind event of this duration and intensity would bring down lines across the county probably within 12 hours. The substation equipment, stressed by load surges as electric heating systems struggled against the cold, would trip its protective circuits. Restoration would take days. In 1949, it had taken 11 days. He told Dora he was going to fire up the dryer and then walk the fence line to check that the hog lot panels were secured. She poured him a second cup of coffee and told him to stay on the rope. The power went out at 2:17 p.m. on January 19th. Roy noted the time on his pocket watch, a habit his father had instilled. The discipline of recording facts precisely when they occurred, and walked to the window of the house. The yard light, which had been burning since noon in the storm's darkened sky, was out. The barn light, which he could just see through the driving snow, was out. Across the fields to the east, where he could normally see the roofline of his neighbor Harold Kessler's barn, there was nothing but white. He went to the dryer shed. The fan had stopped, it ran on line power, but the firebox was burning steadily, and the grain bin's interior temperature was still well above the 110-degree drying threshold. He connected the fan to the small 3.5 kilowatt gasoline generator he kept for exactly this contingency. Enough power to run the fan and the stirring auger, nothing more, and the drying cycle continued without interruption. He had 17 gallons of gasoline for the generator, which at the fan's consumption rate of approximately 0.4 gallons per hour would last about 42 hours, enough to finish the current batch and one more. But beyond that batch, the wood dryer needed no electricity except for the fan. He had already considered this months before. He had a second, older fan in the equipment storage room, a direct drive model from 1952 that ran on a small gasoline engine, requiring no connection to the grid at all. He had maintained it because it was useful for supplemental ventilation in the corn storage bins during summer. In an emergency, it could replace the primary fan on the dryer indefinitely, as long as he had gasoline for it. He had 31 gallons of stored gasoline in approved containers in the equipment room. He was, in the specific sense that his grandmother had meant, prepared. The calls began on the second day. The first was from Harold Kessler, who farmed 420 acres to the east, and whose Sukup propane dryer had, of course, stopped when the power went out. Harold had approximately 800 bushels of wet corn, harvested at 22% moisture in October, and awaiting drying sitting in his wet bin. At 22% moisture, at the current ambient temperature of -22 degrees outside and perhaps 15 degrees inside the unheated bin, the corn would not mold immediately. But the cold would not dry it either. When the weather warmed, when it inevitably warmed, the wet corn would begin its biological work, and Harold Kessler would have a problem. "Roy," Harold said on the phone, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man asking a favor he knows he has no particular right to ask. "I've got 800 bushels sitting wet, and my dryer's dead. I don't know how long this is going to last." "Bring it over," Roy said. "I can't pay much right now." "I don't want pay," Roy said. "After the storm, when you're back on your feet, you and your boys come out and help me cut and split next year's wood. We'll call that even." There was a pause. "That's more than fair," Harold said. "It's what the wood costs," Roy said, and meant it precisely, not as generosity and not as a transaction, but as an accurate accounting of what he needed and what Harold could provide. The second call came from Dale Huffman, whose farm was 3 miles south along the county road, with 1,200 bushels of wet corn, and a wife who had called the power company twice and been told restoration was not expected for 5 to 7 days. The third call came from Frank Overholzer, who had 600 bushels and a generator that had failed to start in the cold, the carburetor frozen, the battery dead from the sustained low temperature. Frank had no backup plan. Roy told him the same thing he had told Harold: bring the corn, pay in labor. By the end of the second day of the storm, Roy Abernathy had commitments from 6 neighboring farms to deliver a combined total of approximately 4,200 bushels of wet corn to his dryer. When the roads were passable enough to move grain trucks, he had, between the fuel for his generator and his remaining wood inventory, the capacity to dry all of it. He did the arithmetic in the woodshed by lantern light, the way he did any important calculation, on paper, with a pencil, checking each step. His dryer could process 800 bushels per day at full operation. At 14 cords of wood remaining, minus the 1.4 cords he had already burned in the first 2 days, he had 12.6 cords left. At 1.2 cords per day for the dryer. That was 10.5 days of dryer operation. 10.5 days, at 800 bushels per day, was 8,400 bushels of drying capacity. He had 4,200 bushels of his neighbor's wet corn coming, plus whatever remained of his own, perhaps 200 bushels for a total demand of approximately 4,400 bushels. He had nearly twice the capacity he needed, even accounting for the supplemental heat load of the hog barn. He closed the notebook, put out the lantern, and went to bed. The storm lasted 9 days, not 9 days of continuous blizzard. The wind dropped on the 4th day and the snowfall stopped on the 5th, but 9 days of temperatures that held between -15 and -28 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills that kept road crews off the secondary roads and made any outdoor work a physical test that the county's older residents, in particular, were not well positioned to pass. The power remained out across most of McPherson County for the full 9 days. Restoration came in sequence, the main lines first, then the distribution circuits, then the secondary feeders, and by the morning of the 10th day, most of the county had power back. Several farms on the furthest rural circuits did not have power restored until day 11. Roy Abernathy's farm, as it happened, was on one of those far rural circuits. His power came back on the morning of January 29th, 10 days and 14 hours after it had gone out. In those 10 days and 14 hours, he had run his wood-fired dryer continuously, processing his own corn and the corn of 6 neighboring farms. He had burned 11.8 cords of his 14-cord reserve. He had kept his hog barn at a minimum interior temperature of 14 degrees Fahrenheit throughout, losing no animals to cold stress. He had dried and returned to each neighbor, in sequence, as the roads became passable enough for grain trucks. Every bushel they had brought him dried to 13.5% moisture, properly conditioned for long-term storage. The accounting was straightforward. Harold Kessler's 800 bushels, at 13.5% moisture and the January corn price of $2.34 per bushel, represented approximately $1,872 worth of marketable grain that would have been worth nothing or negative, counting disposal costs, as a bin of fermented, mycotoxin-contaminated corn. Dale Huffman's 1,200 bushels, approximately $2,808. Frank Overholzer's 600 bushels, approximately $1,404. The remaining 3 farms combined, approximately $4,300. Total value of grain preserved for Roy's neighbors by his wood-fired dryer, approximately $10,384. Roy's own corn, 2,200 bushels carried through the season, was worth another $5,148 at market prices. He had accomplished this with firewood that he had cut himself, stacked himself, and owned free and clear, using equipment that required no grid connection, no fuel delivery, no service contract, and no part that could not be fabricated in a reasonably well-equipped farm shop. He had also, in the course of those 10 days, performed the kind of service for his community that has no satisfactory financial measure, but that communities in isolated places have always recognized as the material of their own survival. Phil Decker drove out to Roy Abernathy's farm on a Tuesday in early February, After the roads were cleared and the temperature had climbed back above zero for the first time in 11 days, he drove his souk-up green Chevrolet pickup down the county road, turned in at the gravel drive, and parked in the yard beside the equipment shed. The yard had been plowed clean. Roy had a front-end loader on his old John Deere 4020 and had pushed the snow into windrows along the fence lines, and the farm had the specific, organized stillness of a place that had come through a difficult period without significant damage. Phil walked to the house and knocked. Roy answered the door and looked at him with no particular expression. "Come in," Roy said. "Coffee's on." Phil sat at the kitchen table. Dora poured him coffee without being asked and went back to the room where she was sewing. Roy sat across from Phil and waited. Phil had come with a purpose, and he stated it without preamble, because he was a direct man, and the indirection of the standard sales visit did not seem appropriate to what he wanted to say. "I want to understand your dryer," Phil said. "I've been thinking about it since the storm started. I want to know how it works, and why you built it the way you did." Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come out to the shed." He showed Phil the firebox, the plenum, the drying bins, the connections between them. He explained the BTU output of white oak at various moisture levels, the relationship between firebox temperature and plenum temperature and grain temperature, the importance of airflow velocity in achieving uniform drying without over-drying the bottom layers. He showed Phil the small gasoline engine fan he used when the grid was down and the generator cans he kept full for exactly that eventuality. He talked about wood selection, white oak for sustained heat, some hedge apple for extreme cold situations when you needed maximum BTU density, never elm because it burned unevenly and plugged the flue with creosote. Phil asked questions and wrote them in a small notebook he carried in his coat pocket. Some of the questions were technical. He was a technically curious man, and some were practical, about maintenance and labor and the real cost in time of the system. Roy answered all of them directly and without embellishment. When they came back to the house, Phil sat again at the table and looked at what he had written. He was quiet for a moment. "You preserved what, $10,000 or $11,000 of your neighbor's grain," he said. It was not quite a question. "Something like that," Roy said. "With equipment that runs on wood you own." "Yes. My systems would have cost your neighbors roughly that much in losses," Phil said, "because mine need the grid." "Yes," Roy said again. Phil looked at his notebook. "What would it have taken for me to have sold you a system that worked in this situation?" Roy thought about it. "You'd have had to include a backup that didn't depend on anything I couldn't produce on my own land," he said. "Wood, kerosene maybe, wind, anything that doesn't have a meter on it." He paused. "The problem with your systems isn't the technology. The technology is fine. The problem is that the technology assumes the infrastructure will always be there, and infrastructure fails." Phil wrote something in his notebook. He looked at what he had written. Then he looked at Roy. "I owe you an apology," he said. Roy looked at him with the same weather-watching expression that characterized his responses to statements that required a response but not necessarily words. "At the Farm Bureau meetings," Phil said, "I used your dryer as an example of inefficiency. I calculated your labor costs in front of people and implied you were making an irrational choice." "I know," Roy said. "I was wrong," Phil said. "Not entirely wrong, the labor costs are real, but wrong about which costs matter most." He paused. "I was calculating the wrong risk." Roy poured them both more coffee. "You were calculating the risk that shows up in good weather," he said. "I was thinking about the risk that shows up in bad weather. Those aren't the same calculation." The arrangement that followed from that conversation was not a formal business relationship. Phil Decker continued selling souk-up systems across central Kansas for another 14 years until his retirement in 1992. He sold them honestly and successfully because they were good systems for the conditions they were designed for. But he sold them differently after January of 1978. He began asking, at farm kitchen tables across his territory, a question he had not asked before. What's your backup if the power's out for 10 days? He brought up the blizzard without being asked. He talked about Roy Abernathy's wood-fired dryer, not by name, initially, but by its principle, and he suggested to every customer who was installing a new sukup system that they consider maintaining some form of non-grid-dependent backup. A wood burner, a propane-fired batch dryer that could operate on stored tanks rather than a delivery line. Anything that could operate for an extended period without an external energy supply. He added, to the bottom of the sukup brochure that he left at every farm visit, a single typed line he typed it himself on his home typewriter and taped it to the back cover of each brochure that read, Recommendation: maintain at least one backup drying system not dependent on the electrical grid. He told Roy about this on a visit to the Abernathy farm in April of 1978, when the weather had turned and the fields were drying for spring planting. Roy read the typed line and handed the brochure back to him. That's a good addition, Roy said. It's what you would have told me 4 years ago, Phil said, if I'd been listening. Harold Kessler's 3 sons came out to Roy Abernathy's farm on a Saturday in early March and cut and split 4 cords of green timber from the woodlot along Roy's east fence line, where a row of white oaks had been flagged for removal to improve the fence line's drainage. They worked from 7 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon and left the wood in neat rows to season until the following fall. It was, in the informal accounting of people who have helped each other through a crisis, approximately what Harold owed for the drying of 800 bushels of wet corn in a January blizzard. Dale Huffman sent his son and a hired man for 2 days. Frank Overholser came himself with his son-in-law and spent a full Saturday splitting hedge apple near the south fence where Roy had fallen a large tree the previous summer. Hedge apple was brutal wood to split the grain, twisted and interlocked in ways that defeated even a sharp maul. But Frank Overholser was a stubborn man and he worked through it without complaint. And at the end of the day, the stacks along the south fence were higher than they had been before the storm. The 3 other farms sent men in similar ways. Over the course of March and April, until Roy's woodshed held 16 cords of new cut timber that would season through the summer and be ready for the following autumn. He had begun the spring with more woodshed capacity than when he had started the winter, which was not what usually happened. Dora Abernathy, who had watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent 46 years watching her husband's preparations prove their worth, said one evening in April, "You're going to end up with more wood than you started with." "Looks like it," Roy said. "Is that what you planned?" "No," he said. "I planned to have enough. This is what enough looks like when other people help." Roy Abernathy died in November of 1989 at the age of 84, in the same house he had been born in. He had farmed actively until the spring of that year, when his heart began to give him the kind of deliberate, undeniable signals that even stubborn men cannot argue with. He spent his last summer sitting on the porch in the late afternoons, watching his son David and David's son Thomas work the fields he had worked for half a century. And he told them things about the soil, about the weather, about the equipment with the particular economy of a man who knows he is spending down the last of a finite supply of time and wants to make each expenditure count. He told Thomas, one afternoon in August, about the blizzard. Thomas was 22 years old, and he had been 4 years old during the storm, and his memory of it was the child's memory of lamplight and cold, and the smell of wood smoke, and his grandmother's voice saying something reassuring. Roy told him the full story, the wood inventory, the calculation, the neighbors' calls, the drying, the cordwood in payment, and Thomas listened with the attention of someone who is hearing for the first time a story he has been living inside of without knowing it. "Why did you keep the wood dryer?" Thomas asked. "All those years when everyone else was switching to propane." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your great-great-grandmother lost her hogs because she had corn she couldn't dry when she needed to. She didn't have the right kind of heat. After that, she had a saying about it." He told Thomas the saying. Thomas repeated it back, to make sure he had it right. "Firewood in the shed is yours. Electric and gas belong to someone else. In a blizzard, you can only count on what's yours. That's it, Roy said. The rest of it is just being willing to do the work. The wood-fired corn dryer that Roy Abernathy built in 1944 is still standing on the Abernathy farm in McPherson County. Thomas Abernathy, who farms the 280 acres that his grandfather farmed and his father farmed after him, has maintained it with the same attention that Roy applied, inspecting the firebox liner each fall for cracks, repointing the chimney mortar every 3 or 4 years, replacing the fan belt when it shows wear, keeping a supply of replacement grates for the firebox floor. He does not use it for primary drying. He has a modern LP gas system that handles his normal volume efficiently and economically. He uses it as what it has always been: a backup, a hedge, a piece of equipment that will work when everything that requires an external energy supply has stopped. He fires it up each October, during the first week of harvest, to make sure it lights and burns and moves air through the grain bin properly. He burns perhaps a quarter cord of wood in this annual test, running it for 6 hours while he monitors temperatures and airflow. If everything is working correctly, he shuts it down and stacks the unused wood back in the shed. In the winter of 2021, a significant ice storm moved through McPherson County, not as severe as the 1,978 blizzard, but severe enough to knock out power to rural circuits for 4 days. Thomas Abernathy lost no grain and no livestock. His LP gas dryer was down, the gas pressure regulator had frozen in the first hours of the storm, and he could not get a service call until the 4th day. But the wood-fired dryer ran from the first afternoon through to the morning of the 4th day, processing approximately 1,600 bushels of corn that would otherwise have sat wet through the temperature recovery. He called 2 neighbors to let them know the dryer was running and that he had capacity. One of them, a younger farmer named Kevin Schultz, who had bought the Kessler place 10 years before and expanded it to 800 acres, brought 400 bushels of wet corn on a flatbed trailer the second afternoon and stood in the dryer shed, watching the operation, with the focused attention of someone who is revising his understanding of something. "What does this thing run on?" Kevin asked. "White oak," Thomas said, "mostly. Some hedge apple for cold snaps." Kevin looked at the firebox, the plenum, the bin. "How long have you had it?" "My grandfather built it in 1944, Thomas said. Kevin was quiet for a moment. "He built it in 44, and it's still working." "It's been rebuilt a few times," Thomas said, "but the design is the same." Kevin looked at it for another moment. Then, "My grandfather knew your grandfather." "I know," Thomas said. "Harold Kessler." "Harold Kessler," Kevin confirmed. "He told me once that a neighbor had dried his grain in the blizzard of '78 when everything else was down. I never put together that it was this dryer." "It was this dryer," Thomas said. Kevin looked at it one more time. Then he helped Thomas unload the grain trailer and went home. The woodshed on the Abernathy farm, as of the last autumn inventory, holds 14 cords of seasoned white oak. It is counted every October by Thomas Abernathy, who stands in the shed doorway and calculates what he has against what he might need. The same calculation his grandfather made in the same doorway for 45 years, and his father made for 30 years after that. The cords are slightly different dimensions than Roy's were. Thomas uses 20-inch lengths rather than 16-inch because he prefers the larger pieces for sustained burn, but the principle of the inventory is identical. When the count reaches 14 cords, Thomas closes the shed door and goes back to the house. When it falls below 12, he goes to the woodlot. The difference between 12 and 14 cords is 2 cords. 2 cords of white oak represents approximately 46 million BTUs. At the dryer's consumption rate of 1.2 cords per day, it is 1.5 days of operation. Thomas keeps that margin the way you keep an umbrella in a car that rarely sees rain, because the cost of carrying it is small, and the cost of not having it when you need it is not small at all. His grandmother Edna said it better. though she said it about a different kind of wood and a different kind of storm. In a kitchen in 1937, when the last hog had died, and there was nothing left to do but understand what had happened and decide what to do differently. What's yours stays lit. What belongs to someone else goes dark. In a Kansas January, there is only one kind of heat that matters, the kind you can count on. In the winter of 1978, the Great Plains storm system that struck McPherson County and the surrounding region caused an estimated $100 million in agricultural losses across Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri, primarily from livestock deaths and grain spoilage. The McPherson County Extension Office recorded, in its spring 1978 report, that farms operating electric and propane grain dryers without backup systems lost an average of $4,200 in grain value during the 9-day power outage. Farms with non-grid dependent backup systems, numbering 11 in the county's inventory at the time, lost an average of $340, primarily from spoilage of grain, already in deteriorated condition before the storm. Roy Abernathy's farm was not counted in either category. It was counted separately, under a notation in the Extension Office records that read, "Primary and neighbor grain drying service maintained throughout outage. No losses reported." The extension agent who wrote that notation was a 28-year-old man named Gerald Watkins, who had grown up on a farm in Harvey County and who had, in 1978, been on the job for 3 years. He wrote to Roy Abernathy in March of that year to ask if he would be willing to be profiled in the Extension Service's quarterly newsletter. Roy declined, citing a preference for privacy. Gerald Watkins wrote in the margin of Roy's letter, in pencil, for his own reference, "Offered to help neighbors at no charge except labor for next year's wood." This is a man who understands the actual cost of things. He kept that letter in his files until his retirement in 2004, 26 years later.